Good afternoon, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington. Good evening, London and Berlin. And good morning, Los Angeles. I'm Dmitry Glinsky, and I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of our association. ARA is a 12-year-old network of exiles and new Americans from Russia and other former Soviet countries. We work on organizing our community, raising awareness about the human rights struggle in Russia, and on anti-war projects in response to the Kremlin's aggression in Ukraine. This is the third year of our public dialogues on Zoom that we've held with Russia's key human rights defenders, US State Department staff, and many others. Today's event is truly special. We are doing it jointly with the Andrei Sakharov Foundation and Radio Sakharov. For over 30 years, the foundation has supported the preservation of memory of Sakharov's thought and action, for which it was branded as undesirable by the Kremlin. And Radio Sakharov has been set up recently in Berlin by the leadership of the Sakharov Center that was based in Moscow for 30 plus years, until it was also shut down by Russia's Kangaroo Court. Our discussion today is part of the day-long schedule of events by the Global Democracy Coalition, of which ARA is proud to be a partner organization. All the events of this program by such institutions as Freedom House, Counterpart International, and others are intended as civil society contribution for the third Summit for Democracy. We at ARA have been privileged to take part in the work around the summits since before the first one was held by the Biden administration. All of it has been remarkably open for the typically excluded voices of grassroots diaspora NGOs, including such heavily accented voice like mine. And this administration's intent has been to not just defend democracy, but also to make it more inclusive and equitable than before. These summits and the forums around them were launched in response to internal and foreign threats, not just military, but also the threats of disinformation and corruption, as well as the backsliding in some democracies in various dimensions, the weakening of their institutions, and the rise of contenders for power who see foreign despots as their role models, threatening a radical revision of the West's post-World War II identity. The dictatorship in the Kremlin is using these developments to its strategic advantage through a wide range of tools, from propaganda, relying on such people as Tucker Carlson, to daily nuclear threats, and aims for such changes inside key democracies that would make them converge toward Russia's own system and no longer present an attractive alternative to any Russians. But we will now step back from all this for a dialogue with our recent history. Russia's major historian, Vasily Krzyzewski, noted that history does not teach anything, but instead punishes us for not learning. So we're inviting you on a learning trip on our time machine some 40 years back to the final pre-Gorbachev stage of the Cold War. There are some grounds for comparison with the present day, even though any such comparison has its limitations. To begin with, relations between Moscow and the West in the early 80s were far less confrontational than they are today. However, like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was condemned by the majority of United Nations member states. The Carter administration imposed grain embargo and other sanctions, which, like the current ones, were criticized as ineffective. The US and European societies had strong groups that were pushing for accommodation with the Kremlin on various issues. Some of these groups then, as now, had direct and indirect relationships with Moscow. The KGB also severely cracked down on dissenters. Some of the most courageous among them died in labor camps in those years. They included Ukrainian Vasil Stus and Russian Anatoly Marchenko. Less than a month after the invasion of Afghanistan, academician Andrei Sakharov, by that time Nobel Peace Prize laureate and the moral authority of the international human rights movement, had his car stopped in the middle of Moscow traffic, and together with his wife, Helena Bonner, was soon transported to the city of Gorky, nowadays Nizhny Novgorod, to isolate them from the outside world. But that purpose failed because over the 7 years there, in between their continuous harassment and free hunger strikes, Sakharov produced important writings on world affairs that were then carried by Helena on her daring trips to Moscow and were published in the West. And at least some of the recommendations were, let me phrase it carefully, taken into account by Western governments in pursuing the policies that soon contributed to Gorbachev's reforms, after which for about a quarter of a century, Russia and the West were not threatening each other, but instead worked together on many issues. So not being an academic historian and not claiming to be an expert of Sakharov, I see my purpose here merely to open this discussion for those vastly more knowledgeable. For this, I'd like to share an outline of some of the key points in his political works that I assembled in English and in Russian. Sakharov's main focus at the time was on the imperative of preventing a nuclear war. In his first major statement from Gorky, he stressed that the questions of war and peace and disarmament must be given absolute priority. In his most extensive work of this period, that he also rated in his memoirs as his most important, that was his open letter to Sidney Durrell, a close friend who was a theoretical physicist and advisor to the government. It was published in Foreign Affairs. Its key point was that even a limited use of nuclear weapons would likely escalate into what he called a general suicide, and that they can have no other use whatsoever except deterring a nuclear threat, which of course is hugely different from Russia's current rhetoric that essentially threatens the use of the nukes even in response to just about any unspecified encroachments upon Russia's sovereignty. Sakharov's other emphasis was on the need for Western unity. He saw, quote, the disorganization and intimidation of the West and the exploitation of its technical and economic capacity as the Kremlin's key goal. He was concerned with Western dependency on oil and Soviet efforts to weaponize it, which, as he stated, caused huge misfortunes to Arabs, Israel, and other nations of the Middle East. He also warned rather farsightedly about democracies becoming inundated, in his words, with people promoting the interests of Soviet expansion, some of them doing it on account of ideas that deserve to be debated, while others, including politicians, businessmen, government advisors, and media owners, being bribed. He stated this with authoritative certainty, meaning that he had strong evidence from first-hand sources. Telling a New York Times commentator down here at the bottom of this page dismissed this statement as bitterness and a strange comment. In fact, it was an early warning about the Kremlin's export of corruption, recognized 40 years later as a major threat by the US and others, including in the US administration's first ever anti-corruption strategy. Since Sakharov's time, what he called the Kremlin's fifth column exploded in size as Russia's upper class used its plundered wealth to buy itself a place among global elites. Meanwhile, those who fled from the regime have seen the Russian establishment's influence in their daily lives in the West, including in access to employment in Russia-related fields, funding for immigrant services, etc., while the exile community has been marginal. Sakharov's positive vision was centered on the idea of convergence between the capitalist and the socialist system. In 1974, he wrote that the result of such convergence should be a mixed economy, combining the maximum flexibility, freedom, social achievements, and capacity for global regulation. In 1988, he stated that convergence presupposes renouncing the dogmatic approach to capitalist ideology, and he cited Sweden as a positive example. Both the goal of convergence and the goal of getting rid of the weapons of mass destruction were written by him into the draft constitution published shortly before his death. One of the Soviet reformers said that the Swedish option didn't work out in Russia because of not enough Swedes. I think the more accurate explanation is the dominance at the time of what was called the Washington Consensus, with its market fundamentalist approach to economic governance, reflected in then IMF prescriptions. In Russia, this led to oligarchic quasi-privatization, perpetuating monopolies, extreme inequality, and the weakening of the social safety net. This consensus eventually impacted systems of the countries that followed it in political ways, weakening democratic institutions, while in Russia, as would be expected, it helped the bureaucracy and the security machine to wipe out emerging elements of democracy. Fortunately, in the US, after the threat to its democracy burst out in the open, the current administration took major steps toward more economic equity, using antitrust to address monopolization, etc. And in my strictly personal assessment, these are the policies that 35 years ago would have served as a much better example for Russia and would have been closer to Sakharov's vision of convergence. Instead, Russia experienced what some called negative convergence, combining the worst of both systems, as stated among others by Yefrem Yankelevich in his introduction to the 2 volumes of Sakharov's works, where he also showed that Sakharov was by and large a social democrat. Yet social democracy was the one current that was blocked from developing in post-Soviet. I also actually wrote a bit about negative convergence in a book that I produced 20 years ago in collaboration with Boris Khadarlitsky, who, by the way, in addition to being a scholar and activist, is both a former and now in his advanced age, the current political prisoner, along with Vladimir Karamurza, Alexei Govinov, Ilya Yashin, and hundreds of others. Which brings me to Sakharov's darker warnings, namely that the Soviet deeply cynical and sick society presented a danger to itself and others, with cruelty on a mass scale and the authorities' total unaccountability toward their own people and the rest of the world. And this is a Russia that democracies are facing today in Ukraine, in Syria, in parts of Central Africa, in cyber and outer space, and if not stopped, may soon be facing on other battlefields as well. So with this not very encouraging or empowering conclusion, let me pass the floor to our most distinguished speakers.